have a chat around this subject. It's not an overly long presentation, so it gives more time at the end of the Moot to just have a conversation about things. Whoops, play. There we go. So we need to start by some terms that you will have come across, and transmigration, resurrection, metempsychosis, and reincarnation, really powerful words. Transmigration is the idea that the non-physical essence of a living being goes into a physical form or a body after death. So that's transmigration of the soul. Resurrection, which is a very different thing, means that the soul comes back into the same body. And as we'll see, the Christian and the Egyptian myth is all based around resurrection. The Egyptian mummies and all that kind of stuff wasn't about sort of a rebirth or reincarnation. It was about a resurrection of the body, either in an afterlife or in a heaven or a hell or whatever. And the two words that really we need to pay attention to is metempsychosis and reincarnation. And that's when the soul, or whatever this thing is, moves to a new infant or animal to live again, depending on your belief system. And reincarnation derives from the Latin term that literally means entering the flesh again. Now, there's a long history of reincarnation which we'll explore, but it's in the last sort of, since the 1960s, I guess, there's been an upsurge in interest in reincarnation themes amongst, let's call it, the New Age community. And it became very popular when a gentleman called Edgar Cayce, who was the sleeping prophet, you may or may not have heard of, started to tell people they were reborn, they'd lived before. So we'll talk about that in a moment. Some of the key things we need to think about, and I haven't got any answers for this, this is where we can talk about it later, but, you know, generally the soul is seen as this immortal thing that becomes, that lives on beyond the death of the body. And the idea of the soul exists in so many different cultures. The way they describe it is slightly different, but basically there is a part of us that is eternal, that moves on, and when we die, it goes somewhere else. And so this idea that the soul can move into other bodies and come back in, say, human form or in animal form, exists in a lot of cultures. And we're going to see in a moment how people have used this idea to talk about their own specific forms of reincarnation. So reincarnation is a widely held idea. The first references to it appear around about 1,000 years BC in the Vedic, the Eastern myths of the Upanishads and the sacred poems of that particular time. So we're talking about sort of India and that area. But the books before that don't mention doctrine of karma or rebirth, but they do mention a belief in the afterlife. Yeah. And most of our ideas in the West, we've really borrowed from the East, particularly ideas of karma and the ideas of rebirth and reincarnation, the way that we're seeing it. In Jainism, which is one of the oldest religions, and Hinduism, which is the oldest religion, the soul, or the jiva or atman, exists and is eternal, and it is seen as passing through cycles of transmigration and rebirth. It doesn't mean they're necessarily reborn into people. It could mean they're reborn into other sentient or even non-sentient beings. And the idea of karma, the amount of good karma we've stored up, dictating to what kind of form we end up coming back as, exists with Hinduism and Jainism. And we also popularly believe that's what Buddhists think, and I'm not sure they do. We'll talk about that in a moment. The problem with Buddhism, it's not a problem, but it's interesting, is that they do talk about cycles of rebirth, And it's the central part of their philosophy that we go round this cycle of birth, death, rebirth, and it's a cycle of suffering. And we continue to go round this cycle until whatever it is that's returning becomes enlightened enough to let go of going around that wheel. I love the idea that Buddhists have this idea that the cycle is of aimless drifting, wandering, or mundane existence, which they often talk about when we're trapped on this plane. The problem that we have, and this is something that you like to think about, is that central to Buddhism also is the idea of impermanence, that there is no self. Okay, and one of the problems that keeps us locked into this cycle of reincarnation or incarnations is the fact that we hold on to the fact that we, the self, is actually unchangeable and immortal. Okay, and the change here is that we have to free ourselves from those attachments in order to be reborn, or in order to move beyond reborn and find enlightenment and Buddhahood. So there's a real interesting tension between the idea of reincarnation, as we often talk about it, and what the Buddhists believe as no self. There is nothing permanent. So whereas the soul could be talked about being the permanent thing that keeps reincarnating, in Buddhist tradition, there is no permanence to that. So what is the thing? As I wrote in an article some time ago, where does the smoke go? And if you want to dig that out, it's on a platform called Medium. So what else have we got? The ancient Celts, we do know, believed in reincarnation. In fact, in the 1st century, various historians wrote that the Celts had adopted the Pythagorean idea of the transmigration of souls, and that souls were immortal, which in some of the stuff that's been written about the Celts, or some of the, shall we say, the propaganda that was produced by the Romans, that was one of the reasons why they didn't fear death and they were so strong in their battles, is that they were actually ready and wanted to go to the next life. And it's interesting that both Alexander Cornelius, Polyester, wrote about this in the 1st century, but also the various Roman emperors have written about the Celts or the Gauls' belief in reincarnation. And it's often suggested that because the Celtic tribes were often so tied together, they were so kind of connected with each other, that was because they felt a kind of a connection beyond this life to a prior life and a life afterwards. Of course, in Alexander's quote there, he talks about Pythagoras. Yeah, Pythagoras was the guy who did the thing with the triangles. He was a Greek, a very clever Greek. And what you may or may not know about Pythagoras is that he wasn't just a mathematician. He led a group of, he led a cult of beliefs about how the universe could be coded into numbers, which is why mathematicians were so well respected and highlighted in his cult. And he observed people that were mathematicians that were trying to work out how the universe worked. And he sort of, him and his teachers started to talk about the harmony of the 7 planets and the 7 musical scales and the 7, and that whole philosophy based around the number 7. And of course, central to this was they believed in reincarnation, so much so that the Pythagoreans, his cult, actually were not animal eaters. They would go out of their way not to interfere with any other living creature, except that they were vegetarians, and I suppose eating vegetables in some traditions could be seen as a problem because they were alive too. The leading thinkers that we know about, Socrates and Plato, also believed in reincarnation, and I think that's really interesting that it was a topic that was made sense to the ancient world. This idea that, well, of course, when we die, we come back in some form or other, and the only arguments really was how we came back, and whether we came back as a god, or whether we came back as an enlightened person, or whether we came back as a slug. It depends upon what the different beliefs were. Jewish mystics, and this might sound a bit odd, but Jewish mystics in the medieval world actually tried to explain afterlife through the universal belief in an immortal soul. They didn't go as far necessarily as talking about reincarnation the way that we know it. However, in the Kabbalah, which was the highest form of Jewish mysticism, there was a belief in reincarnation, and it's still universal in Hasidic Judaism. There is this belief in reincarnation, which is, I think that's really fascinating. Whoops. Sorry, my computer crashed. I hope you're still getting this. So Christianity comes along, and of course, Christianity is not about reincarnation at all. It's about resurrection. It's about the doctrine of salvation of the faithful after dead, and some will potter their way up to heaven, and some will be reborn in a renewed Eden. And so early Christianity rejected reincarnation as a doctrine. However, as we saw when we talked about the Spanish Inquisition a few weeks ago, that there were several heresies in the early medieval church, and there were several groups that did believe in reincarnation. The Cathars one, the Patrines, the Albigensian Church, the Paulicans, and the Bogomils, and we talked all about those when we talked about the Spanish Inquisition a few weeks ago. And so these heresies were crushed because they were not conducive to any form of salvation. If you're going to be reborn, why do you need a church to help you be saved? Is an interesting question. And it is important to reiterate that Christian and ancient Egyptian beliefs centered on resurrection, not on reincarnation. The effort they put into preserving the body of the pharaohs was because the body would be reanimated after the soul, or the part of the soul, had traveled through its various adventures in the underworld and came back. And so the body was so important. So these are resurrectionist ideas, not reincarnationist. Taoist philosophy, I kind of feel a kind of pull to Taoism because I like a lot of the ideas. But this is a wonderful quote from Chang Tzu, a 3rd century Taoist. And he's talking about not being a beginning or an end. So therefore, the concept of birth and the concept of death is really difficult to get your head around if you're a Taoist. There is existence without any limits. There is continuity without a starting point. Now, we in the West find this a really difficult concept because we conceive a time as linear, with a point that we were born and a point at which we die, and they are bookends to the life that we lead. What happened before our birth, actually, we've had to look to other ideas to find that out. And what happens when we die? Well, we've borrowed a whole wealth of ideas from other philosophies and other traditions. So there is birth, there is death, there is issuing forth, there is entering in. And this idea of entering in, what are you entering into? Which is where the idea that the life exists on different levels, which can be equated to animals and humans, but also in different dimensions would be the modern word, but in different places that we can't even access. And so the idea is that whatever this soul is, it can exist. It has existed since the beginning and will continue to exist because there is no end. It will just change form, which I think is a really interesting point to think about. So enough of the philosophy. Here is something that might blow your mind if you haven't heard about it. I'm going to tell you about James Houston. Now, James Houston was a naval pilot. He was on the ships that were supporting the troops on Iwo Jima in the Second World War. And on the 3rd of March, he took off from the USS aircraft carrier Natoma Bay. As he attacked a Japanese transport vessel, his plane was shot in the nose and he crashed into the ocean. His friend, Jack Larson, was also shot down in that raid. So that was in 1945. In 1998, Bruce and Andrea Leninger gave birth to a baby boy, and they named him James. No great shakes there, but what happened next was really interesting. When he was 22 months old, James and his father visited a flight museum, and James discovered a fascination with planes, especially World War II aircraft, which he would stare at in awe. Within 2 months, James started saying the phrase, aeroplane crash on fire. And they'd say that when his father was off on a trip at the airport, but he'd say that because of the nightmares. He would slam his toy plane's nose first to the coffee table, ruining the surface with scratches. And James started to have nightmares, waking up with screaming words like airplane crash on fire, little man can't get out, while thrashing and kicking his legs. And he drew that kind of drawing, which was interesting. Eventually, James got to talk to his parents about what he was dreaming, and he said, when he was slightly older and could articulate this, before I was born, I was a pilot, and my airplane got shot in the engine, and it crashed in the water, and that's how I died. James said that he flew off a boat, and his plane was shot by the Japanese. When his parent asked the name of the boat, he said Natoma. When his parent asked the name of who the little man was, he would say James or me. And when his parents asked if he could remember anybody else, he offered the name Jack Larson. And when James was 2.5, he saw a photograph of Iwo Jima in a book and said, my plane got shot down there, Daddy. When this was reported, it caused a stir. And it caused a stir because there was no connection between the families over time. And this boy was apparently having memories of a previous life and could come up with specific details that could be checked. Now, the skeptics at the time were actually saying, well, obviously he's primed for this, his parents, but there is no idea what the motive would be for that. I'll share some more with you. There was a toddler in Sri Lanka and heard her mother mention the name of an obscure town called Kartagama. And the girl had never been to that town. It was an obscure little town in Sri Lanka. But the girl informed her mother that she drowned there when her dumb, mentally challenged brother pushed her in the river. That she had a bold father called Harath, who sold flowers in the market near the Buddhist stupa, that he lived in a house and had glass windows and a roof and a skylight. The dogs in the backyard were tied up and fed meat, and that the house was next door to a big Hindu temple, outside of which people smashed coconuts on the ground. So this little girl heard a mother mention Kartagama, and she came up with that. When her claims were investigated, it was discovered that there was indeed a flower vendor in Kartagama who ran a small stall near a Buddhist stupa, whose 2-year-old daughter had drowned in the river while the girl played with a mentally challenged brother. The man lived in a house where the neighbors threw meat to the dogs tied to the backyard, and it was adjacent to the main temple where devotees practiced religious ritual of smashing coconuts on the ground. The little girls did get a few things wrong, however. For instance, the dead girl's dad wasn't bald, but her grandfather and uncle were, and his name wasn't Harath. That was the name of the little girl's dead cousin. But 27 of the odd statements she made that seemed to come from nowhere, out of the 30 that she made, were verifiable. And the two families had never met, nor did they have any friends, co-workers, or other acquaintances in common. Again, this is interesting. Now, even if I was a skeptic, a cold-nosed skeptic, I'd be saying there's something here that's really interesting. These children are remembering stuff that they couldn't possibly know and remember. Something is going on here, probably. It could be, of course, that one skeptic could say, well, they're from a culture that believes in reincarnation. It's very easy for the parents or the adults to guide the child into remembering this stuff by not even deliberately, but unconsciously dropping comments and dropping ideas that the girl comments on. I can see very easily, did they have dogs in the backyard is the question, to which the little girl answered yes. It is then reported as they had dogs in the backyard. There's stuff here we're going to talk about in a moment, but still, it's very interesting. And it inspired this guy, Ian Stevenson, who was an academic chair of psychiatry at a university in America, to start to collect cases of children remembering being somebody else living before. And during his lifetime, he had 2,500 or more documented cases like the two we've just uncovered. He tried to write papers, and they never got published in the mainstream journals because there is such a thing as, I think sometimes scientists aren't actually real scientists, they're just closed skeptics. But he collected this information. Now, if you read anybody who wants to promote the idea of past lives and past life regression, they will quote this guy as saying that he proved past lives. In fact, he didn't. I don't think anywhere in his writings did he say this proves reincarnation. It was, this is a really interesting phenomena and we must look at it because it may be that. And he was open-minded. He was a very good scientist. He documented things and he raised questions. But I think on the one hand, the skeptics have questioned the way he collected the information, but shall we say the believers have taken him on as a kind of hero and saying, well, he actually said there was reincarnation. No, he didn't. He had 2,500 or even more documents that he passed on for people to start to research, because science isn't about answers, it's about questions. Carl Sagan, Carl Sagan is a hero of mine. He was the skeptic. He was a skeptic. He was an astrophysicist. He was a cosmologist. He actually produced the television series The Cosmos. He was involved in developing the SETI project, which is a search for extraterrestrial intelligence. He is the guy that designed the Voyager mission and actually put the gold plate on the side with the information it took out of the solar system. And he was also the guy that convinced NASA to turn the Voyager spacecraft around to have a last look at the Earth as it left the solar system. And it came with a fantastic picture called the pale blue dot. But he was, as a skeptic, he wrote a number of books, basically saying, don't try not to get taken in by false claims, pseudoscientific claims. His last book was called The Demon Haunted World, and it really was a classic work on skepticism. However, even he said in his book that young children sometimes report details of previous life which one checking turned out to be accurate, and which they could not have known about in any other way than reincarnation, is worthy of further study. See, the thing that a lot of people forget about Carl Sagan is, although he was an arch skeptic and he was a very clear thinker, he was also, when he didn't have an answer, he said he was an agnostic. So when people said to him, do you believe in God? He said, I've got no evidence either way. Yeah. Do you believe in reincarnation? I've got no evidence either way, but we need to look. And so we got some people out there who are scientifically trained who are saying that we need to look at this stuff. We need perhaps to be not open-minded, but accept that there's stuff going on in the world that we don't know about. And unless we ask the questions, we never get the answers. I love it, the fact when he said we need to engage this stuff with openness but scrutiny. This is how deep truths are winnowed from deep nonsense. So, this stuff about young kids reporting stuff piqued his interest. But there are real problems in doing any research on past lives, real problems. My computer's crashed again. Hold on a sec. Yeah. there are real problems with actually researching this stuff. I'll go through some of them, but we can talk about more a bit later on. First of all is the nature of human memory. We now know that the brain doesn't store memories in the way that we thought they did. There is no part of the human brain that can actually contain your memory of yesterday or last week or last month or last year. All memories, when they come to us, are reconstructed in the moment from the associations we have. So when people say that they've got a vivid memory of something, that vivid memory isn't stored anywhere, it's recreated in the moment. And because of that, it can easily be tinkered with. And we can easily believe in stuff that isn't our memory, but it's been suggested to us. We take it on board as a memory, which is a real problem if you're doing past life regression research. I'll put the next one down as the reality of hypnosis. We all know what hypnosis is, but there's a huge debate about what hypnosis actually, what it is, what sort of state is it? Is it just relaxed and daydreaming state? Is it a state where you can be told to believe things? Is it a state where you can actually be told not to believe things? Does the conscious mind get so far out the way that it opens itself up to other things? In fact, although I've trained as a hypnotherapist, I'm not sure what hypnosis is, other than a deep state of relaxation where the person who allows themselves to be relaxed becomes more suggestible to the subtle things that I might say. There's this thing about researcher bias. Most of the past life research that's ever been done has been done by people who actually believe in past lives. They have an agenda. Okay, Stevenson was a collector of information, but if you've got an agenda in your research, you can skew the results. We've got false memory syndrome, the idea that people can actually be given a memory of something they never really experienced, as was the case in a lot of the satanic abuse cases back in the 70s and 80s. Children were telling people they've been involved in satanic ritual, and they weren't. That was the counselors who were Christian giving them the clues and interpreting it one way and asking questions based upon the interpretation. Then we've got this thing about anecdotal reports. All of the stuff that Stevens collected was anecdotal. You can't actually do a scientific experiment for past lives. Well, I'll talk about how you could, but you can't really. And then lastly, if you're going to do a strict scientific experiment, you have to have an idea about the mechanism that you're claiming might be at work. Now, the problem is this, that if I just said the soul moves from person to person, the mechanism there isn't clear enough as far as science is concerned, because you don't know how it moves, why it moves. You may know it moves after death, but why does it come back so quickly or whatever? Now, a number of years ago, and some of you may know this story, and I tell it sometimes, I got really interested in past lives. And not that I'm still interested in them, but I'm agnostic, if I'm honest. And at the time I was just finished my training in hypnotherapy and all that kind of stuff. And so I thought, I watched a couple of programs on experimental results of hypnotherapy that were actually mainstream. The one was the Bloxham tapes, which a guy called Arnold Bloxham apparently regressed people and found that they lived sort of impoverished lives in the middle of England or whatever. And then there was an Australian researcher whose name eludes me at the moment, but he was hypnotizing housewives in Australia who recounted stories of being in Germany, being in Somerset, being in various places in Europe. They'd never left Australia. And he brought them to these various places in Europe where their memories actually came back stronger. So one lady from Australia remembered being a surgeon in Edinburgh and went to the college where she was trained as a surgeon in a previous life. One lady was a farm girl in Somerset, And they took her to the barn, the place that she said that she used to work, and she pointed at the floor and said, "There's a stone floor under there with a marking on the flagstone." And sure enough, when they dug the earth up, they found flagstones. And these were interesting, and they intrigued me. But there was a problem with both of them. From a scientific point of view, the hypnotist was actually involved in the hypnosis and the research to get the questions to ask them under the next sessions. And so without meaning to, they could influence the results, again, by subtle questioning. When somebody is relaxed and is open, and you're confirming that they were a surgeon in Edinburgh, and you ask the question, what street we on? Was it on such and such a street? And that comes back. And so people's, he, without meaning to, could have influenced the memories this people were having. So I sat and thought about this for a while, and I decided that there was a way, a protocol, an approach which might prove interesting. So what I did was I advertised. I was living in London at the time. I advertised in the local papers for people who wanted to undertake a past life regression for collection of information and to uh, see, yeah, to see if this stuff was real. As you can imagine, I got inundated with people who wanted to do this, but I had some very strict criteria. For me, I wanted people who were open-minded, but I didn't want believers who were just really believed everything. And I didn't really want closed-minded skeptics, because they're two ends of an extreme. So I chose people who were open to the possibility, but weren't sure. B, who actually could work with me in hypnosis, because and in some cases make sure they could bring a kind of a person to support them along with them, and agree to a number of sessions, which they did, which they didn't pay for. So that was the front end of the research. The second bit of the research was actually getting in touch with some historians. Now, I had a friend that graduated in historian, social historian, and I contacted him and said, look, if I send you some claims, or if I send you some scripts with people talking about historical events, do you think you would be interested in reading the scripts and checking out the information? He said, yeah, I'd love to do that. I didn't really tell him about past lives. I just said it was about historical information. I said, there's an important thing you've got to do here. So when you look at the information, you have to grade it according to a scale. And the scale was general knowledge, some historical knowledge, that people would know this, and right the way up to there's no way anybody would know this unless they'd researched it fully. So it was a graded 7-point scale. And I said, at the same time, I want you to contact 3 other historians that I don't know and ask them if they want to be involved, and they will receive scripts from me, which he did. So I had 4 historians ready to receive these scripts and to grade the information on a scale of how accurate and how interesting it was. But then I said to them, at the end of each session, and you take the script, you have to send back to me questions I can ask the person more about this history that they claim to know about. And they said, okay. I said, in those questions, you mustn't tell me anything about the stuff that you found to be correct or stuff that checked out. You've got to just tell me what questions you want me to ask next time, and throw in a number of stupid questions or red herrings that would actually have got nothing to do with the research that you've done. So I hope that's clear. There was this protocol around it, and we entered into this, and I sort of 6-7 months down the road, there were a number of clients who actually did come back with telling me they'd lived before and telling me stories. Some of the stories were, in my opinion, they were fantasist. They were creating, it was a creative part of the mind. Some of the stories were actually, I think, the unconscious mind giving us messages about therapies and repressed memories, but of this life. But there were 1 or 2 that actually came up with stuff that the historians that I was using in the test actually telling me that this stuff isn't general knowledge. This stuff is very specific, it's very detailed, they had to go out of their way to find this stuff. So either the person is deliberately trying to create a story for you, or they've got a genuine insight into where they lived and what this area was, which I thought was really interesting. One of the girls particularly, she recalled, I think it was 6 different life experiences, and she remembered being in various places. When she gave the dates of the deaths or births of these characters, these 6 different characters, they were within a year of each other. So when one character or identity died, a year or so later, another one was born. And what was fascinating about in that case is that the historians managed to find the birth certificates of a number of these people she claimed to be. And they even found a living relative of the last person she claimed to be. And at that point, we had to draw a line under the research and say, okay, now this person was somebody who didn't necessarily believe in this stuff, but we got something interesting. And, in terms of ethics, we couldn't carry on anymore because we weren't going to turn up on this person's doorstep and say, boy, this person remembers being your great uncle or something. But it was interesting. It was fascinating. All of the people that went through the experience had a lot to integrate into their belief system. So I carried on seeing a lot of these people free afterwards to make sure that they weren't left hanging in the air without any kind of resolution for themselves. So we went on counseling sessions. But the report that I managed to put together, which was published within my professional organization, captured enough interest from America, where somebody was actually working on memory and witness statements, and they liked the methodology. And so that's how I got the PhD, by the way. The methodology was broadened out. So technically, my work and personal interest in past lives led to some other work, which was about memories and stuff like that. But the reason I'm telling you that was the fact that even at the end of it, the mechanism was the problem. Did this girl report the 6 lifetimes? Was it a genetic memory? Was it something that's passed on in the genes? Was she related, a distant relation of these people? Is it something that she's synthesized from childhood in various stories and they came out and check out? Or is it a soul moving forward between bodies? Or was she just psychic? And that's the problem when you do this kind of research, because the mechanisms are so broad, it's very difficult to nail anything down. But I thought I'd share that with you because I think that was kind of interesting. Just briefly talk about this guy, Jim Tucker. Jim Tucker took over from Ian Stevenson. He was the guy that Ian Stevenson trusted to take over those 2,500 documents and start to research them. And when we're looking for mechanisms, it's quite interesting that he has come up with an idea which may explain a mechanism. And it's not overly complicated, but it just really is interesting that he has this concept that the mind is limited physically, but it's not limited in terms of what it can produce and what it can actually access. And he talks about the idea of that the mind actually goes through several dreams. And when we wake up in a dream, we think it's a life. The mind is convinced that that's a life, but the mind is eternal. It's not the soul, it's the mind. That's it. Interesting idea, and you might want to look him up because he's got some interesting thoughts. This is getting a bit weird because most people, and I think you, me, and everybody, have a fairly good grip on what we think is real, i.e. what is in this world. And these ideas are about we're not living the life we're living in an illusion or a dream. In fact, I think it's a cruise line that's using the fantastic Alan Watts to talk about its cruise line. Alan Watts, as some of you may know, was a Zen Buddhist who really, in the 1960s, was teaching the West about Buddhism. But his the advert and the recording they've used to him is saying that, imagine that you had a dream where you had everything you wanted to do. What would you do in that dream? Well, he said you do all the things you wanted to do, that you'd actually spend all the money, you go on the trips, you'd have all the relationships you wanted. And if that dream was about you having anything you wanted, you'd live that dream. Eventually, you'd be living that dream so long that you forget you were dreaming. That's very similar to what this Jim Tucker character is saying. We forget that we're dreaming. And as we spoke about in a Moots several months ago about the world of Maya, matrix, and illusion, the idea that we're living in a world that actually is limited only by our own perceptions. The Dalai Lama's got some really interesting takes on this, as you can probably imagine. And this is where, if you really want to dig into this, try to get your head around what Buddhists actually say about karma and reincarnation. My understanding at the moment is that we have many lives, but it's not the soul that moves on. It's when we die, the smoke, like the smoke on a candle flame, it goes somewhere else and is connected to something else, into realms that we cannot possibly understand. And the question that you might want to ask a Buddhist is, if they believe in reincarnation, are they actually being attached to the idea of continually coming back? And if they are attached, is that because they haven't been liberated from the attachment and therefore are not enlightened? So the Dalai Lama has said himself that he actually believes that some of this stuff that the kids particularly are talking about is worthy of research. And I think he says that we should look into this stuff. But he also suggests that, does it really matter? Does it really matter that maybe we were Boudica in a previous life? And one of the things that I'll add to this at the moment is that when I've been asked to do past life regressions to people, which I actually do, but I'll explain the reasons I do them in a moment. There are some people who really just want to do the regression to prove their pain comes from a past life, or to prove they were something better in a past life, or perhaps something worse than in a past life. They want it to validate their current self, which actually, if there is no self, it's an ego thing. And we have to be careful of that in these discussions. I do say that I do past life regressions, and that's because as part of self-development, I find it really interesting when people are taken through the process and are allowed to explore imagery and ideas as if it was a past life, and then look at it from the point of view, well, what part of you does this represent? What part of your current desires does it represent? What part of your current belief system does this represent? And come out at the end of it saying it may or may not be a past life. That's not what we're going for. What we're going for is attempt to understand the entire person that you are now. So that's the way why I do past life regressions from time to time. So I think this for me is a really powerful quote, and I've nearly come to the end, so you'll be pleased to know that. Because there is no self, because identity is an ego thing, how can it survive? And I think this quote sums this up for me. Even in our lives today, we're just an ever-changing collection of consciousnesses, feelings, perceptions, and impulses. And we hold that together to maintain the illusion of a self. In reality, and this is tripping into something else, the only part of our lives that there's any power in is the now. We've come from somewhere, yeah, but that's all of our history, and we're going to somewhere, perhaps, but it's a shifting view of moment to moment to moment, and we change moment to moment to moment. As the old sort of adage is, you can't jump into the same river twice. So we are changing all the time. So self is not permanent. It's the kind of question mark I have when a medium tells me that my mother wants to contact me. Yeah. Does she? How do you know it's my mom? Or is it something else that you're trying to tell me about? And you've made it into my mom because you need to pass the message through in that form. Now, I'm not saying mediums don't make stuff up. Of course, I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is how we perceive that sensory information is really influenced by what we believe and what we feel. And if we let go of the illusions that we create, maybe we'd be more enlightened and be living in a happier world. More of that later. So I've got an idea to share with you. And yeah, some of you may have heard this before, but I'll share it with you. I call it the gloop. And this really is this came to me after watching Star Trek. All right. Sorry about that. I'm a Star Trek fan. And the Star Trek episode I'm talking about particularly is one of the spin-off series called Deep Space Nine. And in Deep Space Nine, there is a character called Odo. And this Odo character is an alien. He lives on the spaceship station, and he is the last of his kind. His normal state is a bucket of gloop. So if he's relaxing and not trying to put on a front, he exists in his quarters in a bucket, and he's just a golden, syrupy kind of gloopiness that's intelligent. When he needs to interact with people, he takes on either human form or whatever form he needs to, because the form that he takes presents himself to the world. And because he's living with humans, the form he stays in most of the time is humanoid. So that's the Deep Space Nine story, basically. In one of the episodes, Odo is on an away mission, and they go to a planet they've not been to before. And he suddenly realizes a sense of familiarity with this planet. And on the planet, there's a big lake of gloop, a huge lake of gloop, which when he gloopifies himself and goes into the lake, he connects with his ancestors that have lived through time and beyond time. And when he comes out of the gloop, he disconnects from his ancestors and he interacts in the everyday world. And in that episode, he has a choice of whether to stay in the gloop with his people, who are now not extinct. He knows that now. Or does he come back with the humans to learn more about the humans to take back into the gloop later on? And of course, he chooses to come back with the humans. That, for me, is a really beautiful science fiction idea that stems from ancient mysticism. So what if the gloop, it's like minestrone soup. Imagine a big bowl of minestrone soup, only it's a cosmic size bowl of human. In fact, it's such huge that the minestrone soup, exists everywhere outside of the plane of material. And what if this gloop is not only intelligent, but it also thinks? And because it thinks, it needs to understand itself. And so the gloop has allowed the creation of other things so it could understand itself. In fact, the Kabbalists believe that the universe created us in order to understand itself, which is the same idea. However, imagine that in each of us is a ladle of minestrone soup, a ladle of gloop. And it's that gloop that we can sometimes call soul or spirit or whatever, and that gloop exists within us. When we pass, the gloop goes back to the lake and takes our experiences back to the lake of gloop in the cosmos, where it mixes, where it merges and shares the experience of my life and your life and everybody else's life. What if, when the gloop wants to know something more, it chooses another material body and pours a ladle full of minestrone soup back into the thing it's just created? Of course, because it's minestrone soup, there may be a crouton of you, a crouton of me, a pepper of somebody else. And so the ladle that comes back into the body is filled with all these different things that are from the gloop, which is why possibly we feel connection with people. Our gloopy bits recognize their gloopy bits, which is why maybe we have insights into lives that we ourselves haven't lived, but the gloop has experienced. Now, I'm just saying it's an idea. I'm not saying that we should go away and believe it, become gloopites. What I'm saying is that to understand some of this stuff in a mystical or spiritual sense, we've got to step out of the material framework that we're trying to hold everything in. So when it comes back to past lives and reincarnation, do I believe in reincarnation? I'm on the fence. There is evidence that needs to be looked at. But there's a part of me that's saying, like the Buddhists say, does it matter? Because if my past life has influenced where I am now, the only chance I've got to better myself now is to take hold of who I am, where I am, and allow myself to the power to move forward, to learn more and be something different. When people say they've experienced a past life, it's worth asking them what they've experienced, because what they say they've experienced is obviously part of what they are and what they've become and what they were. If they want to hold on to that, that's fine. I think there's a great song by a band. I forgot the name of the band at the moment, but that one of the lines is, and now you told me about reincarnation, I have to go on living my life, making up for mistakes I made in a previous life. Thank you very much, is the essence of the song. And I think, well, need to think about that. Why do we need to know whether we've lived before? What benefit does it give us now? And does it help us become more enlightened and sentient? I don't know the answer to that question, but hopefully I've raised enough things for you to ask about and question about for yourselves. And now let's have a conversation.